On August 23, 1305, the sun rises over London, casting a merciless light on the bloodthirsty crowd packed into Smithfield. In the heart of the square, a grim stage awaits. Ropes dangle, knives gleam with sharpened menace, and a fire crackles with ominous hunger. The air vibrates with the crowd's frenzied screams as guards drag a tall, bearded man, bound to a wooden hurdle, through the jeering mob. His name is William Wallace, a Scottish knight whose defiance has shaken the English crown to its core. In mere minutes he will endure a death so brutal, it will sear itself into history, hanged until near death, disemboweled while still breathing, castrated, beheaded, and quartered. How did a man born to modest nobility become England's greatest enemy, a symbol of rebellion whose name would echo through the ages? To understand Wallace's terrible end, we must journey back to the misty highlands of Scotland, where a young man's heart was forged in tales of freedom and a nation's pride was crushed under the heel of conquest. William Wallace was born around 1270 in Elderslie, Renfrewshire, son of Malcolm Wallace, a minor landowner who served the Scottish kings loyally. The Scotland of his youth was an independent and prosperous kingdom, ruled by Alexander III, a respected monarch who maintained cordial relations with England. But fate turned cruel in 1286 when Alexander died without direct heirs. His only successor was Margaret, a 3-year-old child known as the Maid of Norway. During her journey to claim the Scottish throne, the little princess died tragically, leaving the succession in dispute. 2 Scottish nobles claimed the throne, John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Unable to resolve the matter, the Scottish lords made a fatal mistake. They asked King Edward I of England to arbitrate the dispute. Edward I, known as Longshanks for his imposing stature, was one of Europe's most ambitious and ruthless monarchs. He saw in the Scottish succession crisis a chance to expand his dominion. He chose John Balliol as king, but only after forcing him to acknowledge English sovereignty over Scotland. Wallace's kingdom had become a vassal state, and the national humiliation was just beginning. Balliol, contemptuously nicknamed Tomb Tabard, the empty coat, attempted to resist Edward's growing demands, but was quickly deposed in 1296. Edward marched on Scotland with a devastating army, sacked cities, massacred civilians, and took the Stone of Destiny, the sacred symbol of Scottish monarchy, as a trophy to Westminster. Scotland had ceased to exist as an independent nation. It was in this context of brutal occupation that William Wallace emerged from obscurity. In May 1297, an apparently minor dispute changed the course of history. Wallace was in Lanark when an English official, William Heselrigg, sheriff of the town, attempted to arrest him for contempt of English authority. During the confusion, Heselrigg was killed, some accounts suggest by Wallace himself, in single combat. Heselrigg's death ignited a flame that spread throughout Scotland. Wallace neither fled nor hid. Instead, he gathered his followers and attacked the English garrison of Lanark, killing all the occupying soldiers. The rebellion had begun, and Wallace quickly became the leader of a movement that grew each day. What made Wallace different from other rebels was his revolutionary vision of resistance. While most Scottish nobles fought for their own territorial interests, Wallace fought for the radical idea of a free and independent Scotland. His message resonated especially among common people, peasants, craftsmen, and small landowners who suffered directly under English occupation. During the summer of 1297, Wallace traveled throughout Scotland, gathering support. His force grew from a few hundred men to thousands. He attacked isolated English garrisons, liberated occupied castles, and, most importantly, offered hope to a people who had lost all national dignity. Edward I initially underestimated the threat. He ordered John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, to crush the rebellion with a force of about 20,000 men, professional soldiers, heavy knights, and Welsh archers. For Surrey, it would be a simple punitive operation against poorly armed Scottish bandits. On September 11, 1297, the two forces met at Stirling Bridge, a narrow bridge over the River Forth that controlled the main route between the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands. Surrey, confident in his numerical superiority, decided to cross the bridge and attack immediately. It was a decision that would change military history. Wallace had chosen his position with tactical genius. He allowed part of the English army to cross the narrow bridge, dividing their forces. At the critical moment, When about half the English had crossed, Wallace ordered the attack. The Scots emerged from the hills like a human avalanche, cutting off the English rearguard and preventing more troops from crossing. The battle transformed into a massacre. The English knights, trapped on the north bank of the river with no room to maneuver, were systematically destroyed. Hugh de Cressingham, English treasurer of Scotland and one of the most hated men by the population, was killed and allegedly flayed. Some say Wallace had a sword belt made from his skin. Surrey fled in panic, abandoning thousands of soldiers to death. Stirling Bridge was more than a military victory. It was a national miracle. A numerically inferior Scottish army had completely defeated the English war machine. The news spread like wildfire across Europe. Wallace was hailed as Guardian of Scotland and began being treated as an equal by foreign kings. But Edward IX was not a man who accepted defeats. The humiliation of Stirling Bridge awakened his most terrible fury. He swore he would return to Scotland with a force that would make any future resistance impossible. In 1298, Edward assembled the largest army he had ever commanded, 30,000 men, including the cream of English cavalry and thousands of Welsh archers. On July 22, 1298, the two armies met at Falkirk, an open plain that favored English cavalry. Wallace had learned from Stirling Bridge that he could not repeat the same tactics. He organized his troops in schiltrons, circular formations of spearmen with spears pointing outward, like giant hedgehogs. Between the schiltrons, he positioned his few archers. The battle began with a massive charge of English cavalry, but the schiltrons held firm, Scottish spears piercing horses and riders. For a moment, it seemed Wallace would repeat his miracle. Then Edward revealed his decisive advantage: the Welsh archers. Thousands of arrows began raining down on the schiltrons. The Scots, without heavy armor, were decimated where they stood. The circular formations, so effective against cavalry, became death traps under the rain of projectiles. Wallace ordered retreat, but it was already too late. Thousands of Scots died at Falkirk, including many of the Resistance's finest warriors. After Falkirk, Wallace disappeared into the mountains. Many Scottish nobles, seeing defeat as final, made peace with Edward I, but Wallace refused to accept English conquest. For 7 years, he maintained guerrilla warfare, attacking English patrols, freeing prisoners, and keeping the flame of resistance alive. Edward I, however, had learned that as long as Wallace remained free, Scotland would never be truly conquered. He offered enormous rewards for his capture and sent agents throughout Europe to locate him. The hunt for the Scottish hero became the English king's personal obsession. In 1305, Wallace's luck finally ran out. Betrayed by Sir John Menteith, a Scottish noble who had secretly allied with the English, he was captured near Glasgow. Menteith delivered Wallace to English authorities in exchange for lands and titles, a betrayal that would stain his name forever. Wallace's capture was received with jubilation in London. Edward I finally had in his hands the man who had dared defy him, who had humiliated his armies and inspired a nation to dream of freedom. But Wallace's execution would not merely be a death. It would be a public spectacle designed to terrorize anyone who dared challenge English power. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was brought to trial at Westminster Hall, charged with treason, sacrilege, and murder. He rejected the charges with dignity, arguing that he could not be guilty of treason against a king he had never recognized as legitimate. "I have never sworn allegiance to King Edward," he declared. "Therefore I cannot be a traitor." His courageous words only increased his judge's fury. He was condemned to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most brutal punishment reserved for traitors. The execution was public, a spectacle designed to discourage any future Scottish resistance. On the morning of execution, a crowd of thousands filled Smithfield. Wallace was tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged through London's streets to the execution site, his body wounded by the stones of the road. Arriving at the scaffold, he was partially hanged, suspended until nearly losing consciousness but removed before dying. Still alive and conscious, Wallace was laid on a table, and his abdomen was opened with a sharp knife. His intestines were removed and burned before his eyes. Then, he was castrated, still breathing and watching his own mutilation. Only then was his head severed, finally ending his suffering. Wallace's body was quartered, his parts sent to different cities in Scotland and England as a warning. His head was placed on a spike and displayed on London Bridge, where it remained for years as a symbol of English authority. His arms were sent to Newcastle and Berwick, his legs to Perth and Stirling. But Edward IV made a crucial mistake. By executing Wallace so brutally and publicly, he transformed him into a martyr. The terrible death of the Scottish hero did not intimidate his people. It inflamed them. Wallace's memory became an eternal symbol of Scottish resistance, inspiring future generations of patriots. Less than a year after Wallace's execution, Robert Bruce, grandson of the former throne claimant, murdered his rival John Comyn in a church and crowned himself King of Scotland. The War of Independence resumed with renewed force, fed by the memory of the martyred hero. Edward I died in 1307 during a campaign to crush the new rebellion, taking his obsession with conquering Scotland to the grave. William Wallace's legacy transcended his brutal death. He had demonstrated that a determined people could challenge the most powerful empire of their age. His refusal to accept submission, even facing torture and death, inspired not only the Scots, but liberation movements throughout the centuries. Today, more than 700 years later, William Wallace remains a universal symbol of the struggle for freedom. His story teaches that some ideals are more important than life itself, and that true defeat only occurs when a people stop dreaming of liberty. The hero who was disemboweled in public achieved an immortality that no tyrant king ever reached.